Shalom and welcome to Jerusalem Studio. The Russia-Israel relationship, which was favorable until the invasion of Ukraine, is now a minor casualty of this war, in which Jerusalem has no direct self-interest. At first, Israel tried to avoid taking a position, but American pressure to condemn Russia's policies proved too much, and Moscow countered in kind. Diplomatically, verbal blows are exchanged with the Russian Foreign Ministry signaling out Israeli Foreign Minister Yair Lapid for an aggressive statement, so-called, and blaming him for trying to distract attention from one of the oldest unsettled conflicts, namely the Israeli-Palestinian one. But on the military side, Israel has refrained from helping Ukraine, and Russia kept its coexistence with the Israel Defense Forces in Syria. What does it all add up to? Joining us from Central Israel to discuss this topic is Ms. Sophie Kobzantsev, who is a research fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies. Thank you for joining us, ma'am.
Thank you.
Also joining us from Jerusalem is Professor Ze'ev Chanin, who is an expert on Russian and Middle Eastern studies at Bar Ilan and Ariel universities. Thank you for joining us as well, sir.
Thank you to be with you.
Indeed, and with us here in the studio is our TV7 editor-at-large and host of both TV7 Watchmen Talk and Powers in Play, Mr. Amir Oren. Amir, give us a broader understanding on the current state of play within this context of Israel-Russia relations.
So our two experts here will obviously expand on it, but a few points stand out regarding the latest exchange. First, even if you try to stay on the fence, both sides take offense. It never is that easy to keep neutral because you end up by hurting your relations with, in this case, both Moscow and Kiev, because Israel refused to send even simple items like helmets or vests in order to keep the Ukrainian casualties down, but because of the obvious Russian opposition to it, Israel refrained even from that. Now, regarding the Foreign Ministry's statement of April the 15th, first of all, it's the Foreign Ministry rather than the presidential office. So Vladimir Putin himself stayed out of it. Secondly, and this derives from the first point, it is not Prime Minister Bennett or the Israeli government, but Yair Lapid personally, because apparently he made some statements earlier which angered the Russians. And the third point is that they focused on the Palestinian-Israeli conflict rather than the Syrian-Israeli one, where, of course, the Syrians want to have their Golan Heights back in negotiations, and the Russians at one time were, of course, supporting this position and probably will end up demanding a return to negotiations. But
even though the Deputy Ambassador of the United Nations, the Russian Deputy Ambassador to be precise, did voice Russian dismay regarding Israel's so-called occupation of the Golan Heights and voiced the long-standing position of Moscow about...
But not this time around, not with this statement.
Indeed.
And of course, it has to do with the deconflicting mechanism. And it seems that right now, Syria is not top priority for the Russians now that they are involved in the Ukraine. They even try to recruit Syrians to fight for them in the Ukraine, and they probably lowered their profile, their Air Force profile, out of Khamimim Air Base. So in the most important sector for Israel, that is in Syria, where Israel is battling the Iranians and their proxies, all is quiet on the Western Front.
Indeed. Ms. Kobzantsev, I'd like to refer the next question to you. How do you regard the current state of affairs in this relationship? And should we here in Jerusalem be concerned about the latest developments?
So I would like to remind you, even before the invasion started, there was even harder voices from Russia. If you could recall, there was the GPS issues on the northern border. There was a huge, massive military practice at the Mediterranean Sea, and there was also some official statements of Maria Zakharova, the spokesperson of the foreign minister in Russia. So I think there was, back then, they tried to signal the West that they might set on fire the Middle East and create another crisis, not only in East Europe, but also in the Middle East. They didn't do anything, and the security coordination is still going on. I think that now they are trying to do some voices that are exacerbating the crisis here, but they want to keep the border with Israel quiet. They want still the military presence and the control in the Syrian territory, especially in the Tartarus base, is very important for them. It's a strategic place for them. I think that they are worried more of Israeli actions in Syria than otherwise. So I think that they heard the official statement of Yair Lapid, and they are trying to kind of like signal that we can make a crisis here, but we're just this is just threats on the diplomatic level. It wouldn't worsen anymore. And they also don't want Israel to engage in the sanctions or to do something that will compromise the relations, the economic relations with Russia. So I think it's only signaling. And I think that they are trying to signal also to the West once again that, listen, we can make and set a crisis, another crisis in the Middle East. So pay attention not only to what's going on in Ukraine, pay attention also to what's going on in the Middle East. Indeed. So we see it, I don't think that it will be any further than what's have been stated at this point.
Professor Hanin, do you agree?
Well, okay. If we are talking about Israeli stand or Israeli policy concerning the current war, or continuation of the war actually that started in 2014 at the current stage with the invasion that was initiated by Russian troops on the 24th of February 2022. So Israeli government has to take into account three major objectives. Yeah, one is the internal situation, the position of the Israeli civil society and Israeli public, which also makes a sort of a pressure on the Israeli government, which, as you all mentioned correctly, as Amir said, it is trying as much as possible to sit on the fence. Second, mutual relations, like we say in Hebrew, relations between Jerusalem and Moscow and Jerusalem in Kiev. As we understand, here we cannot find any modus vivendi. Ukrainians and Russians demand from Israeli government two confronting opposite things, which together Israel is unable to fulfill. And thirdly, of course, as you also mentioned correctly, we should understand that, and those who make decisions in Jerusalem understand it, I guess, perfectly well in the regional international context, that in principle, Israel is doing its own war with Iran. I'm not sure whether it will be in the nearest future, the open conflict with the Tehran and so on, but we are in war, in the stand of the war with Iranian proxies. And from this point of view, of course, Israeli government should take into account, first of all, security of their own people rather than, with all the sympathy, security of the peoples of the other states. So if you will permit me, give me another minute and to address very briefly to all the 3 points, starting with their civil society. Israeli civil society is pro-Ukrainian totally, as we can understand. You know, we have a sort of a Ukrainian boom in Israel, exactly as it used to be in 5, 6, 7 years ago in Ukraine. It was a sort of Israeli boom. Ukrainians are talking about Israeli example. Even now, like one of the advisors of the president, Zelensky mentioned, Mr. Vitrovich, he said, on the 23rd of February, we fell asleep in Europe and and woke up on the 24th of February in Israel. That means they understand their situation more or less in the Israeli terms. If we will take into account the Russian-speaking community in Israel, or immigrants from the former Soviet Union, regardless whether they came from Ukraine, Russia, or other states, it's a sort of for the general Israeli society, it's a sort of a reference group in concern of understanding what is going on the Russian-Ukrainian track and the concern of the war in Ukraine. Like in 2014, there were about 30% of the Russian-speaking Israelis that actively or passively supported either side, but then like half of them either openly or passively supported, and 50% didn't support anybody. 3 years later, there were only 20-25% that either actively or passively supported either side. The rest said that Israel is not our war, Israel should not interfere. On the 24th of February, the situation changed dramatically. Like 75% of Russian-speaking Israelis and 74% of the general Israeli public support Ukraine in this conflict. On the other hand, 2/3 of the Israeli public, both Russian-speaking and not Russian-speaking, actually support the position of the Israeli government in this war, meaning the humanitarian aid, meaning diplomatic declarations, but not to be actively or actually involved in the conflict, taking into account the situation here in the Middle East. So what Israel is able to do is actually, besides sending humanitarian aid, is to entrust to the civil society to do more actual aid, including that was mentioned by Amir, and making a coordination, a cooperation with our major allies, first of all, the United States, in the case they will be able to provide armament that might change the situation on the ground, even at the expense of the quota that Israel should get from the United States. Let me not to extend more in commenting this point. Finally, taking into account the situation here in the Middle East, we all understand that Israel, on the eve of the quite possible large-scale conflict here in the Middle East between a pro-Iranian and anti-Iranian bloc, and Israel is fortunately not the single here at the moment. Fortunately, we have allies here in the Middle East. In this situation, Israel is not interested to open another front with the Russian Federation. Russian Federation is not interested to open front against Israel, but that is why talking about statements from the different Israeli parties, they are not much different from the statements until recently from, let's say, NATO states, European states. They declare their unacceptance and declare they're talking about sanctions against Russia. Still, at the moment, Russia gets from Europe like $1 billion a day in exchange to oil and gas and so on and so forth. It might decrease in the nearest future, but still, in practical terms, Israel is doing what it's able to do, especially if in case of decreasing, de-escalating the conflict and coming to a sort of pacifying the issue. Whether it's possible or not, it will be clear for us in the very near future. If 60% or 65% of Israeli public believes that Israeli government is doing well or handling well this conflict, we might say that in the nearest future we will see more of the same.
Indeed. Mr. Oren, sitting on the fence, as you mentioned, and our other distinguished experts have noted as well, has not come kindly by the Americans specifically, who are in a stage of demanding that the international community chooses sides. Each state can decide for itself, but it needs to decide right if it would like to be in favor with the Americans. How has this impacted Israeli decision-making, considering the fact that it needs to, of course, keep in mind, even though there is no Russian interest to exacerbate tensions with Israel in Syria, there is still a very unique relationship there, and Israel will not relent from ensuring its red lines are kept.
So there is the public level on which discourse is being undertaken. And there, you are right, there was a lot of displeasure by the Americans because of the Israeli policy of trying to remain neutral. One response to that was that behind closed doors, if Naftali Bennett wants to be one of the honest brokers between Russia and the Ukraine, although why would they need him and not Erdogan or any other mediator, remains obscure, but nevertheless, it's a good pretext. I can't condemn Putin if I'm going to try to have him concede something through me to Zelensky. Nevertheless, the United States understands Israel's unique position. Israel doesn't want to interfere with Russia's position in the Vienna talks vis-à-vis Iran on the nuclear side. And by the way, there are two other, perhaps more symbolic or less significant issues on the table. One is what is going to happen in early May on the Victory Day in Europe, which for Putin is a very important date, and he wants Israel to commemorate it the Russian way and focus on the Russian contribution to victory over the Nazis, especially now that he's trying to depict Ukraine under its current management as some extension of what happened then. And the other one is that all dispute over a Tsarist Russian asset in Jerusalem, what started under Tsar Alexander has to do with the Orthodox Church. We won't get into all of the details, but the Russian government expects Israel. It went to the courts. Now the courts turned to the political echelons, said, you make the decision, and this is something which Russia expects from Israel to give it, regardless of what happens in the Ukraine.
Indeed, and there have been already overtures by the Israeli government under Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, the former Prime Minister, when they gave Alexander Skort and other aspects as such.
And it's part of a deal regarding an Israeli lady
Syria,
who was sent back to Israel, released from prison.
Indeed. Well, I'd like to ask Ms. Kobzantsev, when we're looking at specifically the ongoing strategic rivalry or conflict between Israel and Iran, and I'd like to touch particularly on the suspended negotiations in Vienna, which have, of course, had Russia as one of the members of the P5+1 negotiate with the Iranians. To what degree do the Russian diplomats take into account Israel's concerns with regard to Russian armament and aspirations on the nuclear file?
So the Russian side in this agreement is important because they are in charge of some of the technology, and they in charge they have a part in this agreement that they have to do. I think that if we recall also about a month ago when Bennett went for his first visit to Russia, it wasn't about the Israeli government stated very clearly that it has to do anything with the nuclear deal, but we can see that few days after there was some publications in the Russian media that referring to this Iranian deal, and they increased that they're very much worried, and they even put a condition on the table that says that they wouldn't sign the agreement if there will be sanctions over the trade between Iran and Russia. So I think that taking into account that they have a great, that they need to play a part in the deal, that the Iranian technology is dependent on, the nuclear Iranian technology is dependent on the Russian technology, and the fact that they want to have a free trade, it's because of the oil prices with Iran. I think that's why the negotiations right now have been slowing. It plays a part for Israel, because the agreement right now is not good for Israel, but it's also not good for major state countries and strategic countries that are the important allies of United States, such as Saudi Arabia. And we see how Saudi Arabia, for example, didn't agree to increase the oil production when the Americans asked it. So we see that there was also the talkings in the OPEC Plus over the oil prices, and we see that Saudi Arabia didn't agree, and it's kind of turning back to the Americans, because I think that they worry of the Iranian agreement. It's bad for them as well. So as far as we see it now, there is a kind of another geopolitical game that Israel can gain from it, and Russia has a great role in it as well. And it's also another kind of it's another a card that Russia can play in order to create another crisis. It's part of its strategy to create crises in the world. So, and the Americans wanted to sign this agreement as fast as they can, and we see that it's not happening. So I think that this is another card that they play with in order to extend as much as they can, and to maybe create another leverage on the Americans on that. So yeah, I think we need to take into account, as far as we know, that what's going on in this agreement, because much of it is not published.
Remains obscure, indeed. Well, I'd like to ask you, Professor Khanin, if you could do so shortly, because we don't have very much time left. The Russians do have interests when it comes to the development of Iran's civilian nuclear infrastructure. Of course, it has at this stage 23 separate projects all over the world, three of which are in the Middle East, including Turkey and Egypt, which the Egyptian one is a joint venture also with the Saudis. But when we're looking at the Iranian file, there are plenty of Russian interests on that specifically. Nonetheless, when I communicated with various practitioners regarding the 2015 nuclear agreement at that time, pre-agreement and post-agreement, practitioners both in Europe as well here in Israel referred to Ambassador Ulyanov as being quite favorable with regard to Israeli guarantees, with regard to Israeli concerns, to ensure that those concerns are taken into account. It seems like now the precarious situation is more complex. What can you tell us about this? Will this, in your perspective, advance Russian leverage over Israel, or the other way around?
I think it's both. Actually, I have not much more to add to what you already said, or said by Mr. Kapzantsev. Actually, I would say that a Russian interest in Iran will go to 3 points. First of all, as it was said, they're interested in getting additional resource from there. Russian nuclear technology, in case they will be developed there, should bring to Russia about $10 billion, which they understand would be very helpful and very important in case Europe will decrease the import of Russian gas and oil. The second point, their interest present to the world that they have their own allies. Not everybody in the world stand for Ukraine. There are some countries that stand for Russia. And exactly in the case that Ukraine is interested to connect Europeans and Israel on their side, in Kiev they understand that Israel is unable in military terms to do much, in spite of the fact that we will probably know, besides what we will know in 30 years, but exactly in the same way, Russia is interested to show that all their traditional allies, China, Syria and Iran and some of the countries in the Middle East are on their side. Even now, it could be proved by the fact that Iran does provide sort of an armament to Russia. And finally, in Russian terms, they are not interested that somewhere in the world it will be an understanding that Iranian oil will be a good exchange for the Russian oil and gas. So that means that all the three objectives make the position of the Russian government is not so easy.
Indeed. Mr. Oren?
14 years ago, when Russia fought Georgia, the Russians were not too happy with some Israeli help, even if it was private companies, private contractors to Georgia, and Israel learned the lesson that it should stay out. Now, Israel doesn't have an interest, not only a humanitarian interest, of course, but geostrategic in the prolongation of the war. Just like the Iran-Iraq war of the 1980s, it is best for everyone for this war to stop on negotiable terms.
Indeed. Well, this is all the time that we have for today. I'd like to thank Ms. Sanskev, Professor Khanin, and Mr. Oren for being part of today's program. And I'd like to thank our viewers as well. And we will see you next time.